All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Here we are. We're covering chapter six of our review of African Americans. This is a university level educational African American history textbook. Thank you so much for joining. Before we get started, friendly reminder, if you're listening on the Instagram Live for the first time and you want access to the slides or things like that, feel free to click the link in my bio. It will take you to the Zoom link where you can then jump in to lecture. You can see the slides, participate in discussion, especially from the Q&A. Hey, thank you so much. I see a guy named Victor from Chile. Thank you so much for chiming in. Um, and then the other thing is, maybe you're watching from YouTube, maybe you're watching on something like that. Feel free to go ahead and like, subscribe, help me out. Just support my page in general. It really helps. Um, let's go ahead and get started. So where we left off, we were talking about first of all, like slaves, the people who were enslaved and their responses to the declaration of this newfound nation they're calling the United States of America, and that these values that it has, its inherent values are built on the notion of inalienable rights, inalienable freedoms that are inseparable from notions of humanity and yet are being clearly separated and withheld from them, right? But less discussed, especially now this week, is what was their livelihood like? What was it like to actually be a slave on the plantation? What were the circumstances? What were their livelihood? What was their diet? What was their work schedule? These kinds of things. What did that look like? So, this chapter, in chapter six, we're covering life in the Cotton Kingdom here, life in the Cotton Kingdom. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I suppose I should preface was saying here, I want to make this very clear, um, is that I'm going to be borrowing from lots of slides, pictures, images from the film 12 Years a Slave. Part of the reason for that is because I think it's colorful, it provides details, it's historically accurate to some extent. So I'm going to be heavily leaning into that. But having said that, I don't want this to become discussion centered entirely around 12 Years a Slave, right? I'm just more so borrowing the imagery. The other thing that I think is interesting to note, is that there are actually GIFs in these PowerPoint lectures, and for some reason they're not activating. I don't know if that's because I am recording. Maybe there's a bunch of other programs going on. I don't think there's an error because it was working on PowerPoint. But either way, feel free to use your imagination. Um, but the point is I want, since I'm borrowing from the imagery of 12 Years a Slave, I want to at least draw attention to Solomon Northup, okay? We were talking several weeks ago about how there were several Black people, especially in the North, who were free, who were property owners, who had their own land, who were intellectually sophisticated, academic oriented, and things like that, right? And so Solomon
Right.
Northup is one of those people that actually finds himself in a situation in which he is kidnapped into enslavement. And prior to his kidnapping, he was actually free. He was educated, still, at least throughout the entirety of his life, remained educated, right? But his description of the nature of being on the plantation, what livelihood was like, the relationships between different people, including the relationships between the slave and the slave master. Um, these are details that are forever memorialized in the book, not necessarily the movie, called 12 Years a Slave, in which he details in painful, colorful detail what that actually looked like. Okay, and so the film I think does a really great job of trying to recreate, like do an honest to goodness cinematic recreation of the major themes and beats of the book. But obviously, any movie that's adapted from a book is never going to be quite as good as the book itself. Having said that, I highly recommend that you read this book, watch the film if you're not really interested in reading it. But nonetheless, Solomon Northup was a free Black man born free, married to a black woman, had several children, and was kidnapped into enslavement around the 1840s. Coincidentally, this is around the time period that we're talking about. And he had tried to escape the bondage of enslavement, but unfortunately, it was so difficult for him to flee that he remained enslaved for 12 years, hence the name 12 Years a Slave, right? Um, and so one of the conditions that he's describing, because most people, especially myself, when I was ignorant, I would always have this perspective of like, oh, oh, no one's gonna hold me enslaved, and oh, if I'm out on the plantation, all I gotta do is run that way, and like nobody's gonna catch me. I'll just hide, and then I'll run at night. And the reality is that in general, you're talking about open fields, open plains. The risk of injury is high. You're getting chased down by hounds and dogs. Then, if you somehow manage to get off of the plantation, you're surrounded by a culture with laws and other people who default to understanding you, a black person, as being inherently enslaved. So it just becomes a thing where the odds of actually being able to free yourself are really just stacked against you. Okay. So we're going to be kind of contextualizing the beats and things like that around what we're talking about in terms of the conditions of enslavement. So just kind of keep this in mind, especially this individual Solomon Northup. Um, the other thing I want to mention is that in the context of the expansion of slavery, we talked about. I think we were talking about what was I describing? First of all, new states being acquired, being declared as new states. And I think we left off on, I think the bill was the Missouri Compromise, right? This notion that America really has to distinguish itself as being comprised of both free and slave states because of the awkward position it found itself in relation to the British. Well, as these territories are expanding, you have to keep in mind that the natives who had inhabited these lands for upwards of 15,000 years are then getting pushed out, right? They're pushing people out, and it's forceful, it's intentional. They're not just accidentally pushing them out, like, hey, we're going to build this land here. If you could scoot over to the side, but they're intentionally trying to displace these people. So many of these natives, I don't have a map here. I didn't even think to include a map until just now. Um, but many of the people that we call Native American, they could have belonged to the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, um, the Missouri people, the Alabama people, any of those people, we like to think of them today as like just being the feather hat wearing Native Americans. But the reality is that most of them, the vast majority, if they were not intentionally killed, were moved into the region that we now call Mexico. So as we have these like ICE raids, as we have this issue regarding so-called immigration, you have all of these issues around people just I don't know, coming back to the US without documentation or something like that. Many of these people, believe it or not, are actually the descendants of those people who were forcefully removed, particularly during the expansion of slavery. Okay, but back to the 1830s and the 1840s, you basically have the US Army that's appointing its military personnel to figure out and use whatever means necessary or possible to essentially kick these people down into the South. Move them, displace them. You can eventually move them westward, but if you move them westward, eventually you'll have to just push them out anyway because we're going coast to coast. So the US military actually was responsible for trying to do its best to cut the numbers down. And by cutting the numbers down, that often meant infecting blankets, infecting clothing, spreading disease among these populations, and then trying to intentionally genocide them, like kill them while they're displacing. Okay. The other thing is what is described as the Trail of Tears is a several miles long line of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, all essentially walking in the same direction, westward slash southward, and what became known as the Trail of Tears, because these are people who were kicked out, killed out, eradicated out, and then you could essentially what's described is this long line of people you could hear from miles away wailing in tears, crying, some people crying in pain, some people crying in agony, and certainly the people that are migrating along these lines are suffering, not just from displacement of their land, but the diseases that they're not being treated for while they're being displaced. Okay. So the US Army is engaging in like this extinction effort to like kill off the natives, and in killing off the natives, that then clears the space for them to expand their state specific territory and therefore expand slavery. Now, yes, you've probably heard this mentioned time and time again, right? There were there were people, natives, who were slave owners. That is true. And some of those people were often displaced and carrying their slaves with them. So black people did, in fact, very few, but a minority of black people who were enslaved found themselves as, if you could describe it or use this words, a victim of the Trail of Tears, suffering much more or less the same fate as many of these other people. Some of these other people were able to successfully move their slaves down into the South, including Mexico and the region southern, right? Which is how you get another wave of migration of Black people that then become present within these Spanish speaking regions. But by and large, this is how the US is expanding its ownership, or its claim, rather, of these territories. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Oh, there's the GIF. I don't know. Maybe the other one just wasn't working. I'm not sure. Um, okay, so as slavery is expanding across the U.S., you have Black people being selectively bred for the purpose of specific jobs. And those jobs could be domestic labor, it could be manual labor, it could be everywhere in between, really. And so what's happening is, because the United States has a desire, I don't want to say the United States, but rather slave owners within the United States have a desire to continue to exponentially grow their profit margins. This often means that they are shying away from trying to spend money by continuing to grab people from Africa, and really just try to grow their own population of slaves, of people who are born in perpetuity in enslavement. They never see freedom. And essentially, their only purpose, their only meaning to their existence is to essentially work. And that's what's happening. Okay. So roughly 75% or so of all of the people who were enslaved throughout the United States, let's say from let's say 1800, I'll just treat that as a conceptual or theoretical cutoff period, from about 1800 all the way through to like 1863. Nearly 75% of all Black people who were enslaved were selectively bred to become agricultural laborers. And this became like the main job. Okay. The other 25%, like I said, are people who are either born of genuine romantic relationships, or they're born and selectively bred for odd jobs. And those odd jobs, I suppose I'm including in that, like domestic labor. Okay. Um, most of the people who owned slaves never really like owned one or two or three. There are some examples or cases of that in like urban slavery, which we'll talk about. But in general, the majority of slave owners generally had like population size numbers. We're talking 20 to 50, sometimes hundreds, and even into the several hundreds of slaves. Okay. Now, because they're still human beings, they still have basic needs like rest and food and care and things like that. Most slaves, like your typical agricultural slave in some capacity, stayed on a plantation, and they usually stayed in like a slave quarters, The slave quarters was usually a building that was built by the slaves for the slaves. The slave masters didn't necessarily go out of their way to like help their slaves build their own shelter or something like that. Um, the onus is kind of just on them to be able to provide for themselves in addition to the standard labor that they're engaging in on the plantation. So essentially, the life of a slave is like work some more. You're working at nighttime, you're working during the day, you barely get rest here and there, but you've got to get your needs met and you have to meet the needs of the demands of your slave owners or whatever crop is being harvested on that plantation. Okay. So now, in the agricultural sense, the kind of crop distribution is a little interesting, right? Um, in general, right, this is mainly across the South, kind of sporadically through the Midwest, rarely in the North. You have roughly 55% of slaves that are cultivating cotton, and cotton is like the staple crop of the South. Excuse me for a second. Excuse me. Okay. It's like the staple crop. And why is it the staple crop? Well, cotton is well adapted to the climate of the South as well as the Midwest, which means then that you can grow large bales of it. You can harvest it in mass. It has a relatively long shelf life. It stores well. Cotton provides numerous uses, right? Clothing, bedding, furniture. Really, there's nowhere in the world where cotton in some form doesn't exist in surplus. So this became the main crop. Now, having said that, these people aren't necessarily only growing crop. And I would go so far as to say it depends on the plantation. Some plantations grew more than one crop. Most plantations really just specialized in one thing, but there were other plantations that were growing other things too. According to the book, anyway, roughly 10% of other non cotton plantations were growing things like tobacco. This is where I believe I've mentioned that my own ancestors migrated from Ireland and France to work on a tobacco farm as indentured servants, as European immigrants, and they worked on a tobacco farm in Virginia, right? Another 10% or so of non-cotton plantations are growing things like sugar, rice, hemp. 15% or so of the distribution of labor anyway was around domestic servitude. And by domestic servitude, I want to be clear here because this is like the official slash unofficial role of a slave in a domestic household. Yes, we are talking about cooking, we're talking about cleaning, but we're also talking about sex and rape. Okay. So domestic servitude here as a slave really does mean in this case that you do not have any freedom, any autonomy, nothing like that. And so I think I don't want to necessarily put it on this book to say this book does this, but I've seen other African American history books that will describe the role of domestic servitude as people who are, they're responsible for all of the non X related things, and then kind of like briefly mention that maybe a black woman here or there may have been raped or sexually assaulted. And the reality was actually, if you're just going to be honest, all of those things were going on. I don't want to say at the same time and in the same fashion, but if we're going to treat cooking and cleaning as a standard for the job of a domestic slave, then certainly being raped or used as a sexual object was also a part of that job too. Okay. So let's just call it what it is. Let's just acknowledge that that's the reality. Um, and then you have some people don't like to think about this as I don't want to say don't like to because don't like means, oh, I don't like talking about this. That's not what I mean, but rather it's less conventional to think of slavery as it existed in industrial form. And when I mean industrial, I'm talking about the roles of slaves who go out, who learn how to negotiate contracts, perhaps negotiate the bulk selling and distribution of what's being harvested on the plantation, and then having the role of like making money for the slave master. So, like in all ways, some people like to think of like, oh, well, the slave master was like the brains of it all. And really, it's just this person at the top. He's almost like the chief executive officer, the Elon Musk, if you will. Yeah, he kind of calls the shots and tells people what to do, but in actuality, he's actually just exploiting the skills and labor of other people around him. And those people are the ones that are making that happen. Well, in this context, all of this cotton that's getting picked doesn't just stay in the United States. It's getting in circulation with the transatlantic slave trade too. And who's facilitating the trade? Who's negotiating payments? Who's negotiating allocations, right? All of those things. Every single aspect from growth to harvest to distribution is being driven essentially by slave labor. So everything here for the slave master is essentially automated. Okay. And to some extent, if you're willing to, put yourself in the shoes of a slave master in this position. You have extreme comfort, right? You have the comfort to be able to like wake up whenever you feel it necessary. You have essentially a bottomless pit of money. You control resources. Maybe you pay your white overseers. Maybe you don't even pay your white overseers. Like you can kind of see in the GIF here above me here, the overseer who's cracking the whip on these people, he's black. So maybe you don't even have to pay white overseers now. You can pay your niggers to essentially do every aspect of the job that keeps productivity in line. And in keeping that in line, you're basically sitting pretty. And whenever you desire, you can then just maybe grab a negress, because that's what they would call black women, grab a negress on the side, rape her, and then wipe your hands of it, and then go right back to minding your own business because everything is being done for you. You can quickly see the moment you're not willing to shy away from the ugliest aspects of the conditions of this livelihood is the moment you can then understand why so many slaveholding Americans were heavily invested in the preservation of the institution of enslavement. The reason is because it's a life of luxury. It's a life in why do I want to give that up? And how dare these other people vote in ways that make my life harder? I have to go out and pick these things. I have to go out and do. I don't want to. I've got my own money making machine in perpetuity here. Why do these people want to take it away? So you can start to then see that if you can put yourself in the shoes of a slave master who's on the beneficial side of things here, you can then understand why they don't want to give these things up. Now, having said that, what did cultivation around non-cotton produce look like? Well, for tobacco, you have tobacco that's generally cultivated in Virginia and Maryland, Kentucky, North Carolina, Missouri. So we're talking about the East Coast slash Midwest, mostly concentrated around the Bible Belt, if you will. Okay, because in this area, yes, you get snow, yes, you get harsh winters, but outside of winter, the climate conditions are relatively constant, right? And relatively constant enough to be able to cultivate this plant called tobacco that you can then subject to a process where you can then smoke it. You can roll it up into cigarettes or cigarillos or cigars or something like that, distribute that across the world, and generate global profit, right? So just remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. The cultivation of tobacco is very delicate. Okay. And in being very delicate, it means that it requires intensive labor. And with intensive labor, it requires very careful cultivation. You have to monitor the conditions of the soil. You have to make sure that there's no pests. And if there are pests, you have to be very persistent and, let's say, proficient about clearing those pests out. Okay, because those pests multiply in mass. They'll come and they'll eat up the tobacco leaves. They'll eat your harvest, and then you don't have anything. Okay. So in your book, there is a young boy, or was a young boy rather, by the name of Robert Allet. Okay. And Robert Allet is describing his own experience of like being and working on a tobacco farm, in which at the young age of like 8 years old, he's responsible for going through all of the tobacco leaves and deworming them at 8. Okay. So keep in mind, we're talking about child labor. There's no child labor laws here. You could have children as young as 3 or 4 working these fields like these 8-year-olds, like these other adults. Okay. And so then here's Robert Illett, and he's saying that if a slave even so much as overlooked even a single a worm or a tobacco worm, that's what a tobacco worm looks like right here in the corner, um, that perhaps they would be whipped. Okay. Perhaps they would be forced to eat these tobacco worms. And if they eat the tobacco worms, obviously, not only is it gross that you have to eat a live worm and it's gooey and it's disgusting, right? But then, in addition to that, because these worms are consuming the tobacco plant, that often means that when you eat the worm, you get a little bit of the euphoria that comes from ingesting tobacco. Okay. So it's a thing where like imagine being 8 years old. You may have missed a tobacco worm that may camouflage into the mixture of leaves, and then the overseer happens to come and find one and then forces you to eat it. And in forcing you to eat it, trying to teach you to be better about looking for these pests so that you can keep them out. And remember, during this time period, we're talking about the 1800s, they don't have pesticide, okay? They don't have a spray. They don't have these chemicals. It's a manual labor process. And you are relying on an 8-year-old. And if an 8-year-old happens to fuck up, then you're going to punish them the way you punish an adult, which might include even smoking, burning tobacco too, and making them sick to their stomach and making them puke. And even though they're nauseous, they got to get back to work. Okay. So it's harsh like that. Okay, and that's Robert Illett. He describes this in detail in chapter 6, if you haven't already read it. For rice cultivation, rice is usually grown in South Carolina and in Georgia. I know rice is also grown in some parts of Louisiana too, but perhaps maybe back then, according to your book, it's limited to these 2 states. The reason why I know rice was grown in Louisiana is because in my paternal grandfather's childhood years, he him and his parents and his younger brother would work on a rice farm as indentured servants. They weren't slaves, but they were essentially doing the work of slaves. And his younger brother George was just a baby when his mom put him down for just a second to go walk over to a section of the rice farm and do what she needed to do. And his little brother George fell into the water and drowned. And so then my grandfather would then name one of his sons, my uncle George, in his honor. But this is the only reason I know that it's grown in Louisiana. Back to this, in the 1840s, rice essentially requires a kind of shallow level of water, kind of still water, that helps the rice to grow, right? Um, and so then on these rice farms, you have a need for multiple jobs. You could call them specialized roles in a way, right? You're going to have people that are quality checkers. You're going to have people who are harvesting the grains of rice. You're going to have people who are putting down new plots, and you want to keep the harvest and growth of rice going in perpetuity because at no point can you take a break. There's a high demand for rice, especially across the South. So you have on these rice farms then, kind of like on cotton fields too, you have slaves that are taking specialized roles. Not every slave is doing the exact same job in the exact same way, but they fill in the niches for what's responsible for ultimately generating all of this wealth. Okay. So only the plantations with like maybe there were some plantations that had like 1,000 slaves, right? And on those plantations, usually those were the plantations where they're responsible for like cultivating rice. Okay. Because again, you're talking about harvesting by the grain, you're doing it by hand. In order to generate lots of rice in mass, you're going to need an exponentially large workforce. And in that exponentially large workforce, it means then that you're going to have at least upwards of like 1,000 slaves. Hold on one second. Okay. So um, it's going to require you to maintain ditches. You're going to have to maintain dikes. You're going to have to, you're basically growing the rice in perpetuity and then flooding the fields. And in flooding the fields, this is how you end up with sometimes rice farms being the most highly lethal circumstances just because of the nature of working in shallow water, believe it or not. Okay. And then in terms of sugar, right? With sugar, sugar can grow fairly quickly. It too is very delicate. It requires high humidity. But that sugar cane was generally cultivated in Louisiana because Louisiana is a highly humid region, right? So it requires intense labor. It requires careful manipulation because in order for you to get the sugar crystals and the sugar cane, you don't want that to become moldy, especially under high moisture. So the cultivation of sugarcane is incredibly hectic. It has to be gathered quickly. It has to be processed quickly. And this goes not just for sugar farms, but in general, many of these slaves, they're not getting holidays. Okay. They're not taking any days off. You don't get the St. Patty's Day or the Independence Day or anything like that. There are no holidays during this time for enslaved people. Okay. So, in general, you're just working. You get up before the sun rises, you have a quick breakfast, and then you're working and you're working till high noon. You take a break, then you keep working until after the sun sets. And then after the sun sets, then you can go back to your slave quarters and do what you're going to do. And all the while, like I said, people have specialized roles. Some people are harvesting, some people are growing, some people are curating new plots, and it goes on in perpetuity. Okay. So cotton. Now, cotton being the biggest staple here. It really was not as intensive as tobacco, rice, or sugar or something like that. Because again, cotton is very robust. And because cotton is very robust, it means then that like with exception to rice, and because there's such a high demand for cotton, cotton plantations tended to have the most amount of slaves. They were the most prevalent across the South and tended to have the most amount of slaves. Again, I put an asterisk here because it's with exception to rice plantations, okay? Now, you can imagine because there is a global trade economy, not just around slaves, but around the goods that are being reproduced. Okay, and imported and exported, et cetera, that the demand for cotton is going to be very high. Not only can you get cotton in places like the Mediterranean now, but you can get it in places like the United States. And because the United States is growing this and it's throwing a lot of that cotton into this global trade economy via the transatlantic slave trade, it means then that like every year for the next 30 years or so, you have like an increasing demand for cotton that is measured at about 5% increase per year. Okay. So by the time we get to the end of the transatlantic slave trade or near the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the demand for cotton has almost essentially doubled, excuse me, as when we first started in 1800. Okay. Now, with the cultivation of cotton, your potential for profits are incredibly high, right? This is a robust plant. It's got a high shelf life. It's easy to cultivate. You can process it. There's multiple uses for it. The uses last for quite a long time. So not only is cotton necessarily cheap per se, cheap to buy and therefore to circulate in the economy, but it's going to generate the most amount of profit here because there's always going to be a demand for it. You'll never oversaturate any global market at any point in time with too much cotton. That's just not a thing, right? So cotton, again, it is grown in the Carolinas, it's grown in Georgia, it's grown all across the South, but the primary states where cotton plantations were concentrated was Alabama and Mississippi. Okay. And this is technically the reason why they end up becoming what we know today as like the worst states in every US metric, whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in education, is because the history of these states is so heavily invested in cotton cultivation that they almost really didn't put an effort to invest in like anything else in their statewide economy. Okay. So the downstream consequences, even today in 2026, believe it or not, the downstream consequences of Alabama and Mississippi specifically going so hard on the cotton game, um, became a thing where actually the people alive today are still suffering the downstream demographic, socio-demographic consequences of such a heavy investment in the cotton economy is that now these states kind of lag behind on other like basic metrics of quality of life. And most people who live in the South, especially if they identify as conservative or something like that, they don't often think about these things. They have no interest in thinking about these things. And I don't mean to mischaracterize anyone as being like intentionally stupid or something like that, although these states tend to carry that stereotype. Um, but the reality is that part of the downstream consequences of this, it just keeps going and it goes in perpetuity. And part of that going in perpetuity is the people alive today are still in some way suffering from the consequences of a state that never really invested in anything other than cotton cultivation through slave labor at the intentional denial of other people meeting other people's basic needs. Um, so these two states alone had the absolute greatest concentration of plantations in the history of the United States. And that's to put it lightly, I suppose, because, like I said, you really in order to wrap your head around the magnitude of the level of investment that these two states had, um, it becomes a thing where, like 200 years later, uh, I am connecting their lack in, let's say, the statewide competition for best quality of life. Is because they've been weighed down so heavily by just slavery and nothing else. And so that's where these two states get their legacy. Anyway, there we go. Oh, so it does work. I don't know why that didn't work before. Okay. Anyway, so what were the working hours of an enslaved person? I kind of mentioned this already, so because I like to talk ahead of myself, so you'll have to forgive me. But in general, um, obviously most of the labor, the intensive labor, the critical labor is all being driven by men and women. Ultimately, slave men, because they're by virtue of being men, still have like not very much, but a little more social power than women, which means then that like where I told you you have slaves that are going out to the market, they're making these negotiating deals around how much is going to get sold and in what concentration and blah blah blah. It's usually the men that are doing those things, right? But regardless, an enslaved person, man or woman, is getting up before the sun rises. And so before the sun rises is kind of arbitrary. You have to keep in mind during this time period, not everybody just has a watch or a clock. So they're not really just keeping track of the time. Every morning we get up at 4:30. It's not like that. It's kind of arbitrary. It's dependent on the calendar, right? The seasons and things like those. So the time will vary. Having said that, they're always up before the sun rises, so you can generally assume depending on the season, that can be anywhere between 3:30 and 5:30. Okay. And then they get up in the morning. They're responsible for cooking themselves breakfast. Nobody's going to do that for them. Okay. So when they cook themselves breakfast, it means that they have to get up extra early in order to make time to cook themselves breakfast in order to then be ready. After they've eaten breakfast, then they assemble either in an open area, they gather together, they allocate jobs, responsibilities. You do the same thing you did yesterday. We're going to do something different. They would shuffle it up. So it'd be a thing where, like, to some extent, the specialized labor roles did have some flexibility in like we're not just getting up and doing the exact same job every day all the time. Maybe we do the same job for 2 or 3 days and then we kind of rotate in that regard. Now, having said that, are there people who just give up their job as an overseer? Well, no, right? There are some roles that people are kind of permanently performing. Nobody's trading places as an overseer. But having said that, if it's like chopping lumber, if it's harvesting sugarcane or rice or something like that, there could be variation in the role. Okay. Now, you wake up before sunup, You're working all the way through till midday. And at midday, most of the time they're getting like an hour a break. Okay. And that hour break is usually for lunch, it's for rest, sometimes 2 hours. Again, it's arbitrary. Nobody's sitting there with a stopwatch going, okay, now get back to it. It really is arbitrary, but in general, people would fall into the groove of just working on beats, and in working through those beats, you find a groove of like 1 to 2 hours break at midday, and then after midday, you then have people who, they get back to work and they don't stop working until after the sunset. Okay. So they're not working until after the sunset. It means the sun has to disappear, and maybe you can still see light across the sky, but you don't stop until the sun is gone off the horizon. And when the sun is gone off the horizon, then you can break. You can go back to your slave quarters. You can handle your dinner. You could take your rest. You could do whatever you want to do. Okay. But just be ready to get up before sunrise and rinse repeat. Now, having said that, there's no weekends. There's no, you take a Saturday off, you take a Sunday off. It's the Lord's holy day. It's the Sabbath. There's none of that. Okay. And on cotton fields specifically, because for some reason all of my talking points are out of order, cotton fields specifically, the expectation is that per day they are harvesting roughly 2 to 300 pounds of cotton. Okay, so you've seen, at least in a picture, I don't know if you've seen it in person, how small a cotton flower can be. It's only about the size of the hole in my finger here, right? Um, and so you've got to make sure that you're meeting your daily quota of about 200 to 300 pounds per day. Okay. Um, and so if you don't, then kind of like, fudging up in the tobacco farm, there are punishments. And those punishments can be anything from beatings to lashings, to a restriction on dinner, or restrictions on meals or something like that. The punishments for not meeting the productivity demands are kind of severe. Not so severe necessarily that, like, oh, if I don't meet my 300-pound quota, he's going to hang me by my neck. But it is more like, the punishments are severe enough that it motivates these people to try to meet their daily minimum. Okay. Now, um, outside of, that this is a image of Chiwetel Ejiofor playing Solomon Northup in 12 Years a Slave. I didn't really have an image for this one, so I just put his face up there. But the slaves are producing lots of things, okay? They're responsible for lots of jobs. It isn't just cotton and rice and sugar, right? They're also producing hemp, and corn and wheat and oats and rye and white potatoes and sweet potatoes. They're responsible for raising the cattle, raising the hogs, the sheep, the horses, the chickens. They're responsible for taking some of their crops into the market, and then selling those crops, right? And not necessarily selling them in the market that's going to go into the transatlantic slave trade, but just into the market where they can be sold at a grocery store or a grocer or something like that. And then a small allocation could be used for their own slave consumption. To my knowledge, though, most slaves were responsible for growing their own produce separate from what was being grown on the plantation, and then they would use that produce to consume for themselves. But conditions are going to vary from plot to plot, plantation to plantation. Nothing is really ever kind of like a cookie cutter, if you will. Okay. Um, and then that's like the work of a field slave. And for the sake of your book, okay, the book refers to them as slaves. It does this in order to maintain a certain level of like appropriateness, right, and professionalism. But the reality is, I would go so far as to say, outside of the context that slavery is being discussed, no one is really referring to these people as slaves. The norm is just to call them niggers. Okay, so you've got your field niggers, you've got your house niggers, You've got niggers all around, and niggers are just niggers, okay? Um, the nigger is limited to the social role that one might conceptualize a nigger to belong to in the 1800s. Okay. So all of the jobs that the field niggers are doing are the growing, the cattle raising, the cooking, the consumption, and the domestic household labor is left to your house niggers. Okay. So the house niggers here, kind of, this is the Django Unchained image with Samuel L. Jackson and Leo DiCaprio, right? Obviously, they're actors. This is a historical recreation, but I'm doing this just because it's a colorful image, and I don't really have other images, believe it or not. Um, but in reality, the culture norm isn't shying around the use of the word nigger like we do in modern society. And if you don't believe me, you can go back and look at some of the recent reels of that I've been reposting. I've been stitching together these reels of like people from the 60s being interviewed for their perspectives on the civil rights movement, for example. And you can clearly see white people, whether they're conservative or liberal, right, pro civil rights or anti civil rights, everybody is using the word nigger. Okay. Um, and yes, there are negative connotations associated with that word. However, it's in the culture. It's like baked into the culture. So today we have this culture of like appropriateness, but in reality, this is the language that is being used to describe them. And so for the house niggers, the house niggers are responsible for the domestic labor. They're rarely ever, I don't want to say outside because it's not like they're vampires, right? But they don't do outdoor labor. Okay. So the house niggers are responsible for making sure that the master has his immediate needs. That could have been whether it's running a bath, whether that's having your beds made, your meals cooked, your rooms cleaned, any correspondence, if you have visitors or something like that, welcoming the visitors into the home, making sure that they've got lemonade or water or whatever it is, right? Some house niggers were responsible for like being nurses. And I don't want to say like specialized nurses, like you just have a nurse on call sitting in a corner and waiting for somebody to get a boo-boo, right? Many of these house niggers would perform multiple roles. And so usually those nurses then are like the women, right? Usually the women are not just nurses, they're the ones that are cooking. But to an extent, they're like wet nurses too. They're like nannies. They're doing multiple things, okay? And by comparison to the work of a field nigger, the house nigger's work is less physically demanding, obviously, just by virtue of being in the house all day long and being in proximity to the slave master. You could imagine that it's going to be more comfortable by comparison. Michael Brownstein says, I grew up in Georgia, North Carolina, and went to college in Alabama and saw slaver culture was still strong in the 80s and 90s. Also, I lived in the heart of the tobacco country, and yes, it is bizarre. Yeah, absolutely. We don't, we love, us Americans, for some reason, we love thinking of racism as like a behavioral anomaly for some reason, rather than the culture norm. And the reality is that this is the culture, and we've kind of manufactured an alternative American culture that tries to move away from the ugliest parts of this history. But the reality is actually that it's just, I don't know, it's like sticking your head in the sand. Ignoring it doesn't really make it go away. And that's why we're seeing the resurgence of white supremacy in conservative politics today, right? Is because to some extent it was always the culture norm, and that's kind of fundamental to right here. The slaver culture never really went anywhere. Thank you for bringing that up, Michael. And just because slavery was eradicated doesn't mean that the social norms around these cultural conditions were eradicated. They weren't. Okay. So by comparison, you have your house niggers are essentially getting better quality care, livelihood, anything really, than in comparison to the field niggers, right? The field niggers, they're just taking the hardest hits. They're bearing the brunt of it all. But for the house niggers, in order to be allowed into the house, in order to be allowed in close proximity to the master, they have to take baths more regularly. They have to be clean. Their clothes have to be clean. They have to be presentable for any visitors. They need to make sure that the house is maintained in a presentable fashion, which then means that these house niggers get a quality of life that is so comparatively much better than the life of a field nigger. But that often meant that if you're in close proximity to your slave master, you're probably more subject to scrutiny. You're more subject to harsh punishments, including the sex or the rape, right? Including physical assaults, including punishments. Okay. And maybe those punishments are not necessarily the same as the ways that you punish the field niggers. But the nature of the job is you really don't want to mess up. Don't be that person that pours a glass of wine but accidentally spills something over, because you will be made an example of. So the expectation is that the house niggers are supposed to conduct themselves professionally and to perfection at all times under the threat of the same forms of punishment that we've been talking about otherwise. Okay. So, um, kind of by necessity, it's almost by design. The house niggers never really overlapped too much with the field niggers. Okay. Maybe one of the older field niggers was responsible for doing the gardening. Maybe the house nigger was responsible for it. That's a role that's going to depend on the plantation, on the house, on the owner, those kinds of things. But in general, the reason why it's a necessity that you don't have overlap between field niggers and house niggers is because their quality of life is so distinct that it creates a recipe for conflict. And that recipe for conflict is often that the house nigger thinks that he's better than the field nigger and will remind the field nigger that he's better than, right? The field nigger doesn't necessarily want to be a house nigger. The field nigger sees the house nigger as just a nigger, but there's still this interplay of like, I'm better than you. I get better treatment than you. You're just a field nigger. You're worth nothing. You're blah, blah, blah. And so then there's that conflict. There's also the fact that um, if the field niggers and the house niggers were to somehow figure out that they had mutual or overlapping interests, then the house niggers could technically conspire with the field niggers to overthrow the slave master. Okay, because the slave master and his family, they're all vulnerable to the house niggers that they surround themselves by. So there's kind of an incentive to make sure that the rewards for the house niggers being there gets them to kind of stay in line and keep away from the field niggers. Okay. Um, Now, having said that, there's no house nigger that wants a field nigger's job. There's no field nigger that wants the house nigger's job. They kind of stay separate. Doesn't necessarily mean they want their own job, although I would go so far as to say maybe for most house niggers, uh, they probably did kind of want their job. But the field niggers didn't want to be field niggers. They actually just wanted to be free for the most part. Um, so you have this circumstance in which you just kind of strategically make sure that there is no circumstance in which any of your niggers could potentially conspire to rebel or to overthrow the slave master. Okay. And so the way that you do that is you just make sure that the house nigger truly believes he's better than the field niggers, and he kind of reaps the ongoing benefits and rewards of continuing to be loyal to his white slave master. Okay. Um, and then less talked about in comparison to the house niggers and the field niggers, you also then have the skilled niggers. Okay. And the skilled niggers are the ones that have like specialized roles. These are people who their roles are so specific and specialized that it's kind of hard to expect them to continue to do the work of a field nigger or a house nigger. So these are skilled niggers that are like they're plumbers, eventually becoming electricians, they're carpenters, they're blacksmiths. Their jobs are so specific and skilled that they're kind of just dedicated to their craft. Okay. Maybe they're responsible for maintaining slave houses. Maybe they're responsible for maintaining the slave quarters as well as the master's house, fixing any machinery or something like that. But because their job is so specialized, you just don't want cross-pollination in this regard. So lots of skilled niggers would kind of actually have a lot of free time, like free time to be able to go out. Maybe in certain cases, if a slave master allowed, a skilled nigger could go and take up labor contracts for other businesses, buildings, homes, families, and help them to repair their stuff too, and then bring income home to the slave master, right? So, in certain cases, excuse me, um, because the skilled niggers sometimes they would have to travel to get tools. Maybe they got to get spare parts. Like I said, maybe their labor is being contracted or outsourced or something like that. That actually the skilled niggers would end up doing a thing where they get like an interesting taste of freedom, freedom through autonomy, and not necessarily freedom by virtue of like they're no longer a slave or something, but just to be able to leave the plantation and to exist autonomously in a way that either the house niggers or the field niggers never really got to do. Okay. Um, and so to some extent, there were enslavers that recognized that these people are a necessity, but you don't want too many of them because if there are too many skilled niggers, then they kind of feel they'll start to learn that like they're entitled to like this form of freedom and it's not necessarily a privilege, it's something that they kind of want and they'll try to keep it, and you just don't want to normalize that kind of thing. Okay. So it just becomes a thing where skilled niggers are fairly rare. Usually the skilled niggers, they're not like young in their 30s like myself or something like that. They're usually people who are like seniors, they're older. It's just it's not really ideal for them to go out and work under the sun all day or something like that. So they take up a specialized role and they're responsible for certain things, and so they can fulfill a labor capacity in that way other than just through blood sweat and tears essentially, right? Okay. And then I mentioned this earlier, you have something called urban slavery, okay? Where urban slavery is, yes, for the most part, slave labor takes place and is concentrated in the South. Um, but you do have urban cities, metropolitan cities, in certain cases, even urban city centers in the North where technically slavery is outlawed, but certain white people really don't fucking care. Um, so they're slave owners, and usually they're not slave owners in that they've got 10, 20, 50, hundreds of slaves, but may have like one or three under their possession in these urban or industrialized areas. Okay. Um, Especially in the urban and industrial areas, you did have lots of skilled niggers that essentially lived freely. They didn't even necessarily live with their slave master. They probably had their own home, their own living circumstances. They had their own families. They're simply just obligated to show up whenever work is expected of them. And as long as they fulfill their obligations, they're essentially functionally free, right? So in these urban or industrial settings, you would have people who are mainly enslaved to work domestic labor. And that domestic labor is going to be washing, it's going to be waitressing, it could have been artisans. I actually don't know what a stevedoer is. If anyone knows what a stevedoer is, that's listed in the book. I couldn't find a specific definition for it. If you want to chime in the chat, that'd be helpful. You have like general laborers, just people who just, if you need a slave or if you need somebody to do something, they're kind of available to do it, right? Many of the general laborers I would describe as like, I hate making this comparison, but it is one that is accurate. It's people who the people you go to Home Depot and you ask them for help with anything. It's kind of like that. Um, Friendly reminder on the IG Live, it's going to cut off in a few seconds, so just be wary of that. If you want to jump into the Zoom session. Okay. Michael says a stevedore is a person employed or contractor engaged at a dock to load and unload cargo from ships. Thank you so much, Michael. So there you go, right? And like I said, I kind of mentioned this earlier, so that totally makes sense, right? You have slaves that exist at in every potential labor-related and economic niche to facilitate the transactional nature of producing and trading these goods. So that makes perfect sense. Um, and so it was most common. We have a few more slides, so we'll go a few minutes over. Um, just keep that in mind. But it was most common in urban or industrialized areas that an urban slave could purchase their freedom. Um, and again, the urban ones are more likely to be able to purchase their freedom because they have more free time, which means they might be able to make money through some high side hustle or a job or something like that. And in working that side hustle, they end up becoming a little bit more uh, wealthy. I don't want to say wealthy because wealth is kind of a loaded term, but they become a little bit more financially free than their rural enslaved counterparts, right? And so, in general, then, even though these people are working sometimes the same jobs, they're able to purchase their freedom in this regard. Okay. You also have the phenomenon where, like, uh you could have a thing where like a slave could temporarily purchase their freedom. And in temporarily purchasing their freedom, maybe they say, hey, I don't want to purchase my freedom permanently, but could I purchase like a month or two off? And then negotiate with their enslaver for like, okay, I'll give you this money and then I'm free for like a month or two. And if I don't come back in a month or two, then you can send the slave catchers after me to come find me or whatever. But in general, to my knowledge, most urban enslavers and the enslaved tended to honor whatever contract was going on between them. Um, but in general, this does mean that the slaves that exist in these urban city centers are usually experiencing comparable amounts of freedom to the skilled niggers, or just more freedom in general in comparison to their rural counterparts. Okay. So it's kind of implied, not specifically stated until we got here, but it should go without saying, right? That with the culture of enslavement came intentional forms of torture, beating, rape, demotion, humiliation, murder, slaughter in certain cases. And it was intentionally brutal. The brutal aspect of these conditions was an effort to reinforce the inhumane nature around keeping these people in their so-called place. Okay. And in keeping these people in their place, I would go so far as to say this is probably where white people exerted the most amount of physical energy. Okay. A lot of their physical energy would go into um, performing violence against black bodies, killing black bodies, maiming them, beating them, raping them, torturing them, because in essence, it is a power play. It's a power dynamic. And the opportunity to reinforce the power differentials through racial norms then means that although sometimes you will get black overseers who are doing this kind of work for their white masters, most of the time, their white masters are the ones that are doing this, because it just reinforces this circumstance. And when I say humiliation, I'm talking about what you see in this image here, right? Is in this image, this is one of the earliest images in the film after Solomon Northup is kidnapped. Um, and believe it or not, he's actually not hanging by his neck like to die, but rather he's standing on a very slippery patch of mud on his tippy toes. And if he lets down, then he will hang and suffocate. So he's essentially forced to stand on his tippy toes in the slippery mud and kind of fight to keep himself still on his toes. I think for something like 10 hours. It's something ridiculous up there. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of making up the number, but it's something ridiculous up there, like something to the effect of 10 hours. It's not only humiliating, but humiliating in that psychologically it would, in essence, break down this person's um, sense of autonomy and dignity and social status, right? Is that even to a free nigger who knows how to read, knows how to write, knows how to think, is probably smarter than the slave master, you can still psychologically subject them to forms of humiliation that, in essence, force them to be subordinate. Okay. Let me take a sip of water here. Okay, five more slides. Almost done here. Okay. So it should also go without saying that people could be traded at any point in time for any reason or no reason at all. Maybe the slave master just decided that it would be he just wanted $10,000 or something, and I'm making it up. He just wanted a lump sum of money, and one of these slaves is going to go because he just wants money for whatever he wants to do, and it could be like that, right? The level of significance to a slave master is fundamentally different than the level of significance to the enslaved. Okay, for the enslaved, that could have been your mom. It could have been your wife in the informal sense, right? That could have been your brother, your sister, your child, somebody who was significant to you in relation. But to the slave master, it was just to make a quick buck. Okay, and sometimes it's just like that. Other times a person could be traded as a form of punishment. Maybe one of the slaves was caught acting out of line, maybe stole away to another plantation because they got a boyfriend or something over there and got caught slipping. And now that they got caught slipping, I'm going to sell you to another plantation, right? And if ever these people were sold, generally, most of the time, they were moved on foot. And they would have around their ankles something called coffles. The coffles is what you see in this image above me. It's the chain around their ankles. It doesn't necessarily have a ball attached to it, like in the sort of old English prison sense. But it would be a thing if you're trying to move multiple numbers of people, but you don't necessarily want them to try to flee or escape. It's much harder for them to do so if all of their ankles are shackled together. And then because their ankles are shackled together, you then force them to walk because then you kind of tire them out with just enough energy that like they can still move, but they don't have enough energy to be able to flee. Right. So you never really put them in a carriage or a cart or something like that unless it was like absolutely necessary. And obviously, something like that is going to be context dependent. But for the most part, the coffles are kind of a norm. And I would go so far as to say, even in prison culture today, coffles are still kind of a norm sometimes. Okay. So in certain cases, it could have been it's not just your mom, your sister, it could have been your baby. The baby could have been as young as 3 months old, 6 months old, or something like that. And because slave master just decided to sell your baby or sell the mom, these two are permanently separated and never going to see each other again. Right? Okay. Um, and so because of the high turnover, I guess I'll call it, the turnover or the nature of turnover on a slave plantation, you then get a phenomenon where in some cases you did have entire slave families that were all related, right? Um, but in most cases, none of these people were ever related. And so, um, in certain cases, you have Black people who, they have lifelong or decades-long relationships with a significant other. They form romantic relationships, and in forming those romantic relationships, sometimes, have children, get pregnant. Um, and it's okay that those two love each other, they have their own children, and then they go on, and sometimes they're able to raise that family, sometimes that family is disrupted, it's a coin toss really. um But then in other cases, as I told you, slaves were selectively bred. And because they were selectively bred, the selective breeding then means that the enslaver is choosing who they want to mate. And these two individuals did not necessarily need to have romantic relations with each other in order for that to happen. They were just forced to do it. And if they did not successfully copulate and produce a potential offspring between the two of them, they could be held liable, and usually that liability is enforced by some form of punishment. Right. Um, in the context of slavery, no marriages could ever be legally recognized. Okay, so the slave does not have the dignity and autonomy necessarily for the state to recognize a marriage or romantic relationship or something like that. Okay. However, within and between the people who inhabited these plantations, there was often an honor code or an informal recognition that if so and so were a couple, they're together, no one's trying to disrupt that relationship. Okay. Um, Now, in certain cases, I would go so far as to say most cases, most slaves slept in a cabin, but there are some circumstances in which usually the elders or those who were considered to have some form of social status or significance among the slaves could sometimes live in their own cabin on their own and have their own, privacy. Um, but because of the high turnover in the relationships between these people, it meant then that the family dynamics were always unstable. And because those family dynamics are always unstable, it meant then that in order to survive and in order to experience some kind of normalcy, many of these people have to have what are called fictive kinships. Okay. And those fictive kinships is a kind of unique practice that comes from West Africa, but it survives in American culture today. If you're a person who has an auntie so and so or an uncle so and so who's not blood related to you, but they kind of fill in and function in that role, that's considered to be a fictive kinship. Fictive kinships were normal for slaves during this period. It's just the norm. Maybe they inherited a young child who no one is related to, but that young child is still dependent on an elder, on a caretaker, on an adult. Then somebody's going to fill in the role of an auntie. Somebody's going to fill in the role of a mama. Somebody's going to fill in the role of something in order for this child to kind of have a stable sense of belonging within the family social structure. So, for lots of Black people, even outside of the context of US slavery, but as you get into just modern examples of social and family dynamics, it's actually very prevalent for lots of Black people. Sorry, somebody's alarm is going off. Um, it's normal for lots of Black people to have like fictive kinships, these relationships between members of their church or members of some other smaller community that are not necessarily blood related, but they do fill in the gaps for what that Black person might not necessarily have access to. Okay. Um, and so for the children, I mentioned, I think it was last week, I mentioned that for slave children on these plantations, they rarely are given clothing. Like, yes, they have clothing, especially in the winter, but a lot of these young kids could potentially go naked, and just run around the plantation essentially naked. But these children, they are not without a set of rules or structure. So children would often then yield to the authority of their parents, and in yielding to the authority of their parents or their fictive parents, it gives them a dynamic in which they do have a kind of disciplined upbringing. Okay. But the conditions for child mortality or livelihood in this case was a lot more severe than white children. So Black infant mortality rates were incredibly high, in fact, drastically higher than whites. And part of that is because of the severe conditions of enslavement. there's a book that's written by Dorothy Roberts called Killing the Black Body. It's absolutely a phenomenal book. But in it, there's a section in which she's talking about how enslavers would force pregnant black women to dig a hole in the ground, and then force them to bury their belly in that hole just so they can whip them on their backs. So if you can imagine then being in the pregnancy while someone is like whipping you on your back, and then normalizing those circumstances, right? So it's also normal then that like black infant birth weight is significantly lower than white children, and that goes for generations, for multiple generations, so much so that it becomes a phenomenon called the intergenerational transfer of health. There's a scholar by the name of Christopher Kuzawa, who has a large body of publications on this topic of the epigenetic factors and the intergenerational transfer of health from black parent to child, that is contextualized by hundreds of years of every generation experiencing severe forms of mistreatment and uh, in the context of slavery. Um, so essentially, some of the livelihoods for these children were severe because, again, if you can imagine taking one of these kids and forcing them to deworm a tobacco plant, and then if they make a mistake, then you're going to force one of these kids to eat a tobacco worm or to inhale tobacco smoke, and then you're constantly subjecting them to like forms of torture, like you're doing for adults. Um, Only the strongest among these kids are going to survive. And I use the word strongest here with an asterisk, because essentially what we're talking about is children being subjected to torture, and only the ones that are able to then survive those forms of torture are able to then live. So child mortality, not even necessarily infant mortality rates, but also child mortality was a thing too, because many of these kids were put to work fairly quickly. Okay, we have two more slides after this one, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. Sorry to go over. I already mentioned the sexual exploitation here, so I don't really need necessarily to go into too much detail. Now, your book does a thing where it will describe the sexual exploitation as being man, white man to black woman, and that is true. I'm not trying to minimize that or belittle that or anything like that. However, any possible permutation of a rape scenario could happen here. Okay. You have white women that are raping black men, white women that are being, for lack of a better term, gangbanged by black men. Okay. You also have scenarios in which a white slave master is essentially engaged in polygamy. Yeah, breeding plantations. I'm not sure the context behind this. But multiple women for one act of sex, right? But then it's not just adults, okay? So keep that in mind that to some extent, because of the way that we want to appropriate the nature that we describe these things, we often think of like the sexual exploitation as strictly belonging to the adults, and that is not true. Okay, young girls as young as 7 are being raped and molested. Young boys as young as 7, and I'm saying 7 arbitrarily. It could have very well been younger than that. But children are being raped and molested and exploited arbitrarily. Okay, and for different reasons depending on the person. Okay, and so most of the time these enslavers are able to justify their abuse because they are they exist in a cultural psyche or a cultural mindset in which these people, by virtue of their skin color, are inherently less than. Okay, so in essence, if they're going to do their dirt somewhere, it's much easier to rationalize doing it to somebody that you deem to not be as human as you. Okay. At the same time, there was a kind of stigma related culture around the people who would engage in sexual actions with Black people. Okay. And that stigma culture was because there was this notion that, like, the mixing of the races is ungodly or unholy, or like having sex with another black person as a white person is like a sin against God. Okay, so those notions coexist while this phenomenon is happening. And so many of these people, your book describes them as white men, but I would go so far as to say anyone who found themselves in the hot seat in this regard would kind of describe or like justify it as like, well, these black women are like naturally promiscuous. And like, well, she seduced me. And when she seduced me, I couldn't help myself because she just wanted it. So I had to give it to her, right? Um, that believe it or not, I'm gonna make the reasonable assumption that everyone in here is an adult and has seen pornography to some capacity. Um, I know you're familiar with the maid fetish. Okay, the maid fetish comes out of this period in time and the culture of enslavement is that often you have people, mostly white men for the sake of a conventional example, that are like sexually fetishizing their black uh, female domestic laborers. Okay, putting emphasis on the curvature of their bodies, the size of their butts or their breasts or something like that, and then taking sexual advantage of them. Okay. And in taking sexual advantage of them, are then going, well, oh, I got caught. Yeah, but like, black women, they're like animalistic and they really wanted it. And like, oh, she was trying to seduce me. And if she wanted it, then she shouldn't have been dusting the dresser that way. Something to that effect. Eventually, a lot of the like repeated forms of defense that you would frequently hear during this period would be like, well, maybe it's wrong to have sex with a domestic laborer, but at least it reduces prostitution, or like maybe it would promote purity among white women, is that you're not going to sexually use the white women because you want to keep them pure for marriage and for having children. So you just kind of take out all of your urges on these black people, right? And so in some cases, many cases, you had black women. It's not like they're using condoms during this time period. Okay. If they're even using the pull-out method, they're using that, and that's really it. So you have lots of black women that were then getting impregnated with these biracial mulatto children that are then born on the plantation, born enslaved. And then that adds to the slave population that when they get visitors and they see that there's like these light-skinned slaves running around the house, it's like an open secret that everybody kind of knows why those particular slaves are there. So that becomes a thing. Second to last slide here. Um, I should have put this earlier. I don't know. I don't know. I wasn't really thinking about the order of these things, but the often the diet of a slave during this period looked very similar to what you see in this image to my left. Okay. And what you're seeing is essentially like a pot full of different dishes. And in those different dishes, maybe you have a cast iron pot, maybe you've got some fried chicken, maybe you've got some greens or something, maybe some legumes, right? But the point is that like a typical slave meal could look something like this. It doesn't look as colorful and healthy and delicious as the one above me right here that we often conventionally think of as belonging to soul food, but rather that soul food has origins that are rooted in a more boring looking cuisine, like this other image here. The diet of slaves was often deficient in lots of macro and micronutrients, including calcium, vitamin C, riboflavin, sometimes protein too. Because even though in this picture you see fried chicken, in other cases they might have only been eating pig feet, pig ears, chicken feet, something that doesn't have a whole lot of protein or meat, but is more fatty, right? So what would happen then is because this is like the regular form of diet for a slave, you have lots of slaves that are living their entire lives with like these chronic illnesses. Okay. And these chronic illnesses, essentially, their body is trying to come to homeostasis through a enduring lifelong chronic illness, and then to have children is then to pass on at least the trajectory of chronic illness onto those children that are then born under these similar conditions. So while you have like Africans or enslaved Black people that are not necessarily undernourished, you certainly have lots of Black people that can end up malnourished, right? Um, and nonetheless, this gives rise to the cuisine today that we know of called soul food. Soul food is a play on the Black soul or the souls of Black folk, and the food that they would traditionally prepare in the South and on these plantations. It did not necessarily look as good as we know it to be today. In fact, a lot of soul food dishes were made with the entrails and the discarded wastes of animal products. Um, and then lastly, the clothing, because I talk ahead of myself. Right? Where you have a heavy industry on of cotton producing. You then have clothes that are being produced with that cotton. A lot of those clothes are going into global circulation, but you do have slave clothing that is getting kind of made and manufactured and then essentially given to these slaves so that they can cover themselves, right? Um, no, a slave didn't necessarily have a whole lot of control over what they could wear. Okay. Um, and often their clothes were passed down from one generation to the next. Very seldom were their clothes washed. So you could essentially go weeks with slaves never having washed their clothes, and that's just how it was. I know there are some of you that have been on a New York subway and have certainly smelled an unhoused person who has not taken a shower in weeks. The slave plantations likely smelled something like that. So you can kind of keep that in mind. It smells very human, to put it in a sort of neutral way. Um, and then, according to your book, these slaves would receive like allotments of clothing, sometimes twice a year. But in those allotments, they're wearing those clothings for weeks on end. And then the priority is being given to the adults because the adults are doing the most demanding forms of labor, and therefore need some kind of clothing. Where most children, not all, but most children are then left to essentially be naked. Um, and that's just how it was. So I know I went 30 minutes over. Here we are. We're at the end of the lecture. Uh, but I would like to open it up to Q&A. Sorry for going a little over, although I'm sure I've kind of learned now you guys don't mind. Um, so are there any questions? Is there anything you want to talk about? I had a few comments. Sorry I didn't get to respond. Uh, Michael says this didn't stop with the Civil War. It was common under Jim Crow until recent memory. Yeah, but what do you mean when you say this? I'm not sure what we were talking about. Um, but that's where we are. Would anyone like to? Oh, rape. Yeah, yeah, sure. Oh, of course. No, rape is just yeah. That has no end necessarily. Um, but yeah, here we are. We are at the end. Would anyone? Here we go. Elena, does this history mean that everyone in the U.S. is essentially either traumatized or in denial? That's a very loaded question, but yes. Yes, white people are traumatized, many of them traumatized and don't know it, in a racially significant way. Black people generationally traumatized, culturally traumatized, genetically traumatized, somatically traumatized, yes. Um, and I would go so far as to say everyone to some extent, including Black people, can exercise some form of denial. That denial is not necessarily out of ignorance, but rather out of like self-protection, right? If you can imagine even the most severely traumatized person, sometimes a way in which you can mitigate the severity of that trauma is to uh, kind of erase your memory or block certain forms of trauma from your memory, right? And in doing so, that blocking is kind of a denial, right? Um, So yes, I would say collectively, Black America does have ways in which they exist in a state of denial, not necessarily to the same extent that white people do, but yes, trauma and denial. Rodrigo,
Hey, can you hear me all right?
yes,
Sorry, I missed a couple lectures, but trying to stay track on it. I'm recalling from our previous lectures that you mentioned a lot of the common concepts and themes during slavery carry over, like uh, slave owners and capitalism and those kinds of things. Would you say how much of that would be carried over in the sense of like having children? I know like some parents see their children as a form of like investment for like taking care of me, taking care of the parent after a certain period when their children are more, I guess, like in professional career or something like that.
sure. I would say maybe that's a little loaded, right? Because childbearing or having children, the act of having children is something that goes into just the existence of us as animals, as biological organisms, right? So it's hard to attribute something cultural around something like childbearing in any one specific cultural context because it's so fundamental to us just existing that it's kind of hard in that regard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes better sense.
Yeah. Having said that, I mean, I would go so far as to say, like, when it comes to lots of cultural isms that we've inherited from the timeline of American history as well before, the list is endless, and I couldn't just list them off at the top of my head without maybe a more specific question. But I would say that childbearing is just something that's so fundamental to being human that it's kind of hard to attribute it to like culture. So yeah. No, Elena, you did not sound accusatory. I don't know where you're getting that from, but you didn't. Are there any other questions? Another question I have is about the 9 to 5 job model or vacation. You mentioned the way that skilled enslaved people could negotiate their potential leave. It made me think about whether contemporary job culture could be molded after slavery. Um, In what way are you saying? I suppose if it's possible, it might be easier for you to just jump into the chat, turn on your microphone. But I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Um, what do you mean when you say contemporary job culture being modeled after slavery? Uh,
Okay, well, it's not like it's modeled after slavery, and of course, it's not comparable. I just wonder about how this history of slavery transcended into a contemporary work culture because
hmm.
it probably did
Hmm.
somehow. So that's my question.
Oh yeah. So contemporary work culture transcends slavery, not necessarily because of uh, the 9 to 5 job model, but actually just in relation to productivity. So in the United States, and specifically our country, there is a fixation, almost an obsession with profits and productivity. Okay. And that fixation comes from this time period of slave culture in which everybody who was white and wealthy and wanted to come here for an opportunity was trying to find a business related niche that they could exploit. And in exploiting that business related niche, they have to have produce and they have to generate profit. So their obsession is with how much gets produced, how much can be produced, how much you can profit, and you're thinking about the work conditions later. So the work conditions by default, you have to let your working populace, they have to rest, they have to eat, they have to shit. Okay. So you have to make time for those things, but in making time for those things, how can you optimize or maximize productivity? Okay. And so, in optimizing and maximizing, American culture, I'm saying the culture evolves around this idea of how can we get the most amount of labor from a person at a given in a given circumstance. And as time goes on, we get rid of slavery. We start getting labor laws. Labor laws start mandating 5-day work weeks, 2-day weekends, 9 to 5, blah, blah. So you have all of these barriers, but all of these corporations are trying to figure out how they can continue to maximize and optimize while working around these logistics. And this is how you get places like Amazon, for example, um, where Amazon has this notorious reputation of being extremely exploitative to its labor force, and in that exploitation, they don't get they barely get breaks. They're not allowed to use the bathroom. They're not. It's essentially modern day slavery. We just don't call it that because these people get a wage, right? Yeah. And to some extent, it is not necessarily comparable to a sweatshop. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but these sweatshops are like extremely exploitative. But when you start talking about the spectrum of slavery to employment, there's a gray area in between, and so these kinds of exploitative things kind of exist in that in between. Okay. Any other questions, comments, curiosities? No, really? Nobody? You jump into the chat and then you have no questions. You have more, but you want to yield. That's okay. Hi, Michael.
I will just say that, I grew up in Georgia, in Athens, which is a college town, but it's still
Okay.
in Georgia.
Yeah.
And when I was 16, we moved to Eastern Carolina, the part that was settled by English plantation owners, and it was tobacco country. And they would say things like, don't let the kids make too much money, they'll all drop out for the tobacco crop. And, like, I mean, as far as I know, it was white kids that were dropping out of high school, but it was still like, well, they're not humans. They're the poors that do the the harvesting of the tobacco. And in high school, we spent a good number of nights in a tobacco curing barn where you could have a campfire and drink, and no one really could see because you were in a barn.
Yeah.
And then I went to University of Alabama, where the president's mansion, the library, and the early campus were all built by enslaved people.
Wow.
And it was, oh, I go back there and I just cringe.
Yeah.
I'm
Sure.
glad I live
Sure.
in New York.
Hey, but even some of the places in New York are built by slaves, like especially all across the East Coast. But one could say
Oh,
that about the U.S.
no, no, you go 5 minutes out of the state capital, it's Trump country. It's
Yeah,
only the 80% of the people live down at the city that it's a nice state.
yeah, 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 yeah. But that's American history, So, but it's crazy when you have the historical context behind the things that you're seeing, right?
Yeah.
It's eye-opening. Yeah.
My friend Lee, he came and he had so much guilt he had to leave. So I gave him a lot of credit for at least coming. He
Mm.
is a very progressive person, but he's like 83.
Oh wow.
He grew up
Right
in a
on.
very different era.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure. At 83, you've seen your share of shit. Yeah. Right on. Thank you. Um, I mean, Elena, we're here. If you want to ask your question, you can ask.
Okay, I didn't raise my hand, sorry. I have just so many questions, it's crazy. But
Okay.
one of the questions I have is, it can sound a little naive, but I can't like wrap my head around these times and like maybe all these women, meaning probably white women,
Mm.
but aren't there like more stories of like a heroic white woman that would save this baby and run away? Because or I mean this enslaved baby essentially, or more rebellions or something, because I don't seem to hear many, but I still can't believe there aren't. So maybe if there are, I want to ask you.
Yeah. It's going to depend on the circumstance, the prevalence, the individual. I will say we haven't gotten to it yet, but we will be talking about this. There were all white abolitionist societies. and members, some of these members were very radical in their expressions of their hate for the institution of slavery, and for the inhumane treatment that these Black people were enduring. Having said that, there are just as equal, if not more, stories of white women actually protecting the institution of slavery. Um, and that part of it is because it's rooted in an American norm and an American tradition, and in our traditional values that were founded on notions of white supremacy and Black enslavement. It often meant then that the women who belonged to this culture were simply, protecting the status quo. So you have lots of white women who were just as complicit in preserving things, though keeping things the way they were.
Mm-hmm. But like still, I mean, okay, so if there was, I don't remember quite how you phrased it, but it sounds like it was more, the resistance was more institutionalized. Already,
Yes,
more so. Like, I mean, was it like kind of an organization or a group of people
yes,
that's
there were lots of organizations that would try to push for the eradication of slavery. But members of those organizations were also people who helped to facilitate the Underground Railroad. Are you familiar with the Underground Railroad?
not really, no.
Okay, so the Underground Railroad is a term. It's not necessarily in reference to a railroad, but is rather a term to describe how people would uh, house an enslaved person, hide them in their home, and then at nighttime or when people weren't watching, pass them from house to house, person to person, to essentially get those enslaved people to freedom. And so in that sense, the Underground Railroad was very informal, right? It is kind of institutional in that there are lots of people who are collaborating to make it work. Um, but it's informal in that no one is advertising, come here to find the Underground Railroad. It was something that you just, if you're in the right circumstance, you could potentially be exposed to it. Um, yeah.
All right, it makes sense, but what I'm saying by that, like, just one last thing. What I'm
Mhm.
saying, why I asked if it was more like, let's say, like a group of people that's almost like an organization, is
Mhm.
because what kind of perplexes me here is the fact that there is less sort of like individual, like human backlash at the moment. But of course, if it's a system where everyone's benefiting, maybe that's why. But like just more human stories of like where people were like against not forming, not waiting, not organizing, but just like being emotionally
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. There were a lot of people who were emotionally just no. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's
And
great.
most of them were very open and adamant about the fact that they were against slavery. Um,
I will say
yeah.
Albany, New York is a big spot on the Underground Railroad. There's a Harriet Myers residence here, and Harriet Tubman was here a lot. And there's a story that recently kind of came to light of an escaped slave named Charles Now who got caught by slave catchers in Albany. And Harriet Tubman riled up a massive crowd and broke him out and took him to
Wow.
Troy across the river, where he was abducted again
Oh,
and jailed. And a second time in one day, Miss Tubman elicited another crowd and started a riot and sprung him out of jail, and they sent him to Montreal.
wow.
And I grew up, in Georgia and high school in North Carolina, college in Alabama, and in the 80s, if you spoke up too much, people would beat your ass. White people for being a
Mm.
white person who speaks up for people of color.
Yep.
And, that was in the 80s. In the 60s, you spoke up too much, a group of men would come to your house in the middle of the night and abduct you, and you'd never be seen again.
Yep.
And you knew better than to, whatever, stay
Yep.
in your lane. Is that the saying? It
Yeah,
was
yeah, sure.
absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like for white people, it was that unsafe to speak up for the black people, even in the 60s.
Yes.
After
Jim
black people
Crow
start
ended in 60. When did Jim Crow? 64?
64.
But like black people, they went to war like for the US. Like, I
They
mean,
were black people were still informally enslaved until the end of Jim Crow in 64. Like the Birmingham Brick Factory would round people up, charge them with vagrancy, and give them a fine that they had to work off, and they had to work off dormitory fees and food fees. They were
Yep.
basically enslaved for a year or two at the time.
Yeah.
well, thank you.
Do you
Sorry
think that in
to
that
be.
environment where there's no justice, a black woman wouldn't get raped with no consequences?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
And I knew a ton of people who had a black woman who was taken into their house and raised them in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
White people raised by people of color.
Yeah.
And
That it.
even
That's right.
sorry, and even then, yes, exactly. And even then, as a black woman, as the mother figure, it's so like well, such a special bond, let's say, very like I don't know, very I don't know. They still couldn't like it wouldn't be safe to speak up for their benefit around the 50s. Sorry to sound that emotional again. It's just maybe because I'm like a late immigrant, it's still mind-blowing every
It is
time.
so awful. It is very difficult for a modern person to comprehend where we're told even Barack Obama could be president. No, it was absolutely the worst system, and those people, they don't want to let go of their hatred.
Well,
No.
thanks, guys.
Yeah. Actually, Elena, to kind of piggyback off of what Michael is saying, in some of the recent clips that I have been stitching together on my Instagram, if you go back and look at them, some of those clips are of white people who are describing the persecution that they faced for advocating for equal rights in America. Some of them were murdered. Some of them went missing and are were presumed dead. Um, and it was a thing where like any challenge to white supremacy in American society was highly lethal.
So, like, I'm sorry I'm gonna sound, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say something super triggering.
Mm.
So, what happened recently to some people that can be identified as white is not surprising then in this system.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
People who spoke up against ICE, for instance, and then
Mhm.
got murdered,
Yeah.
basically.
Mhm.
In this system and this within the logic of this history, then it's not surprising. It's just
No, it
okay.
isn't.
I think it
When
was late 2020, and 4 or 5 of the Black Lives Matters organizers in the liberal state of Minnesota all were found hanging, and the police ruled it was a suicide,
suicide, yeah.
and
No.
ignored that it was the organizers of BLM.
Oh
You
my
think it's
God.
gone? It's just under the surface. It's better than it's ever been, but it's not good.
Yeah, but the reason why it's better than it's ever been is because around 1964, it became very easy to identify these angry white supremacist people as the bad guys. It's very easy to see that like they really are the bad guys. So lots of conservative whites just started changing their tune. They became a little more silent. They never got rid of their beliefs. Their values never went away. And then here's Donald Trump, who then is coming back out in the woodworks and trying like to make it okay for them to just be open and out about their racism again. And now we're seeing a resurgence. So it never went anywhere. It's always
Uh,
been here.
sorry to ask a question again, but can we then say, again, a crazy like concept, but can we then say that movements like KKK are basically the scapegoat for all this normalized racism and white supremacy? That
Yes.
actually, okay, great. I'm shocked. Sorry.
Yes, it's easy to point to the extremists and go, they're the bad guys. But then to be a moderate who maybe you still share their political values, but you don't share their extremism. And then you go, well, I'm not a white supremacist. And the reality is like it is a political spectrum. And on that political spectrum, they're all on the right side. They're all on the conservative side. But yes, the extremists, the KKK, the so-called alt-right, yes, they're all scapegoats.
You know, guys, today I was going out of the parking lot of Whole Foods. I'm in Nova. And there was literally a car, like there was literally a pickup truck before me that had like the bird, like the SS bird, and a couple of other stickers.
Mhm.
I literally, I'm not sure what this bird was, like, but I can recognize an SS bird. It's not, it didn't say SS on it. And my boyfriend, which is white, I mean, actually, whatever. He was pointing, look, look, look. I said, don't point. Are you crazy? Like, don't point. It's scary. And he's like, yeah, and there is a Marine sticker, which again, like respect to the army, but this combination of things is just so perplexing. And you think, I don't even know what to think at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah. It part of it is that is the extremism of white supremacy. But there are a lot of American white supremacists who don't want to identify with Nazism or anything like that, but still sympathize with the political values of white supremacy. And yeah, it's a spectrum, but it's easy to point to the flag. Yara, hello, Yara. Are you there? Did you want to say something? Maybe you pressed the raise hand button by accident. Okay. Are there any other questions? Oh, here we go. Hi,
Sorry,
Yara. No, it's
I
okay.
was trying to find the the microphone. So I'm from Angola, and I'm living in Portugal for about a few years, and I have my great grandfather was this white military man that went to Angola and married. I think he was maybe 40, 45. And he married my great grandmother, who was a 14-year-old Black woman. And so the whole family has this romanticized concept that and I mean, there's been newspapers in Angola where they're like the first admitted mixed uh, family because it was illegal and the church never wanted to register the children. Um, and so like right now I have this like conflict with my family because I'm like, oh no, he was a pedophile. And it's like shocking, the whole romanticized thing. Um, but what I want to say is that these last years that I've been in Portugal, I have a 21-year-old right now, son. But when he was 14, so he went to I was doing homeschooling and then he went to school here. And the history in Portugal is just it's very violent that they're teaching, and they're still teaching this. So I have two younger boys right now that they're starting to learn histories also. So what I want to say is that what they teach here is the discoveries. They have this really romanticized thing of, you know, my son would come back my home and he would be like, they actually brought civilization, and they just went out for spices first for trading, and then I started having really big conflicts with my son because I was trying to have him see documentaries, you know, the 13th Amendment, and this was 10 years ago. Um, and and my son is it's very hard because I've noticed that all these years there's a lot of misogyny for young boys, but also this concept of um, just this really criminal history of, you know, hiding this whole thing. So I understood that colonialism actually never happened. The mentality is still there, and you can understand that Europe has gone into like really it hasn't gone, but it's become naturalized the rights extremism.
Yeah.
And you notice that in Brazil you had Bolsonaro, and then you had Trump before, and then you have the Italy and Germany, and then you understand now with Palestine, like the UK and Germany, that actually criminalized people in the street saying free Palestine. So then it's really scary because in Europe they're actually teaching this romanticized concept of slavery. And if you go around Portugal, you have all these if you go next to the river in Lisbon, you have this big monument of a caravela of like the ship. You have all these men, and you have like the it's just so it's a
Unsettling.
big atrocity.
Yeah.
And my young boy, that he's like 10 years old now, um he actually started having like really violent outbreaks in school, and they actually invited him out to do like homeschooling. And he tells me that my teacher was, I thought she was really nice, but she was actually telling us that we actually brought civilization to Africa. And she was actually saying this with a smile, and I don't understand. So he's actually too conscious to go to school right now. And and then I have family court within that. They're like threatening me to take the children away because the father is Portuguese. So
That
this like
sounds that sounds like it sounds like what's happening is a rewrite of history for the sake of white supremacy.
yes,
Yeah. It
yes, it's like
it
it's continuing. And then
it
you understand that the court takes children away from mothers, but then you understand it's always done that to black women.
yeah. I would say the question that comes to mind for me is because here in the United States of America there's a kind of historical and political inertia around challenging systemic white supremacist norms and powers,
Hmm.
but I don't know of that history as far as Portugal is concerned. What do you even begin to do to challenge something like that?
I think it's challenging the concept of history,
Mm,
because if they're teaching this to children,
yeah.
they're lying to children, and they're maintaining this white supremacist thing, which is
Mm,
like all over the world. So
yeah.
Portuguese actually began trading. It's not trading, that's it's trafficking. The big movement was by Portuguese people. So Portugal, like for example, in the Second World War, they were neutral, but they were not neutral. They were actually selling
No, they weren't.
food for United States, and they were selling ammunition to Germany.
Mm,
And they were keeping the money also from Germany that were taking from all people that were being murdered. And so then you understand that Portugal is a big criminal, but it's such a small country, and they're
mm.
still teaching the children white
Colonial
supremacy.
history. Yeah, yeah, white supremacy. I'm so sorry to hear that, Yara. That's really unsettling. It's and it's difficult. It's difficult to reconcile that with having to live there and to raise children in that circumstance. And I'm so sorry that you have to deal with that. Um,
Thank you for saying that.
yeah,
I'm not able to leave the country because the Portuguese white father will not sign for the children to leave.
I'm so
And
sorry.
and and I'm starting to study now the history of United States, and this whole thing, and understanding that we're all connected into this, and this
Yeah,
white supremacy and the right extremism. It's all linked, everything. And one of the things that I understood is about coercive control.
mm,
Coercive control is like the beginning of white supremacy, patriarchy,
yeah,
capitalism, and everything that is holding. Like everything is like the systemic abuse that has been normalized, and coercive control. Now I understand is like the root of dominance over others.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, Damn, that's a heavy hit to end us on, Yara. But thank you so much for your contribution. Like I said, I'm really sorry that you have to endure that. Um, and I hope and I pray that something positive can come out of that, but it doesn't sound like it's going to happen for a very long time, not in Portugal. Um, So this is where we will wrap up for this week. Thank you so much for being a part. Next week, we're going to jump into chapter 7. In chapter 7, we'll be covering what it was like to be a free Black person during this exact same period before the Civil War. Okay, so what was it like to be? We've covered today what it was like to be a slave. Next week, we'll be answering the question, what was it like to be free? Thank you so much for participating. Yara, if you're welcome to come back. Please chime in next week. We'd love to hear more from you. Same, Elena and Michael, and anyone else who wants to participate. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I will see you all next Sunday. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Alrighty.